Combat sports are probably amongst the most volatile and tense of all. It will come as no surprise that in these sports based around aggression, tempers are constantly flaring, and with the fact that these sports tend to be extremely lucrative, they are extremely well equipped at generating moments of absurd controversy. Today, we're going to be running down some of the most controversial moments from fighters across combat sports. So, strap yourselves in. First up, Dave Tiberi is robbed. I don't think I really need to do any convincing when I tell you that the decision-making process and the officiating of any combat sport is incredibly important, especially when fights do end up going the distance and require a score result to be determined based off of a panel of judges. Regardless of how flawless the judges may be, this is already a less decisive finish than most fans and fighters would like, and it can lead to arguments after the bout over whether the decision was correct, casting doubt on the result entirely. This becomes so much worse when the judging isn't flawless, and when the judging is outright bad, it can lead to horrifically controversial results that live on in infamy for decades, which is the case with the first entry on our list today. Back in July of 1991, Dave Tiberi, a Delaware-born boxer who'd spent his entire life fighting on account of growing up with 11 older brothers, stunned the world when he defeated the great Eddie Hall to claim the IBC Super Middleweight Championship, the greatest feat yet in a career that touted a record of 22 wins, 2 draws, and 3 defeats. This victory set Tiberi up for a clash with the IBF middleweight champion in the form of American James Toney, who entered the February 1992 bout as the heavy favorite. His record at the time, a particularly impressive 28-0-2. While many expected a Toney victory, very few could have predicted the way in which it would arrive, as one of the most controversial decision wins in the history of the sport, one that led to endless conversation about a full investigation into judging standards. Despite Toney being the favorite, he was absolutely dominated from bell to bell by Tiberi, being hit by 439 effective punches and only dishing out 290 in response. The judges, however, ruled a split decision in favor of the battered Toney, who spent the night in hospital after his victory. Delaware Senator William Roth immediately launched an inquiry into the judges and found that the 2 of the 3 who ruled in favor of Toney were actually unlicensed, whilst the referee for the fight was nowhere near qualified for a fight of this magnitude. Next up, Junie Browning's existence. Switching now from the squared circle to the octagon, Junie Browning is one of those weird cases in the history of combat sports, of a fighter who seemed to have all the essential tools to become a star, but there was just that one key issue holding him back: his own self. Browning became most well known to fight fans when he appeared on the 8th season of The Ultimate Fighter, a reality show crossed with a developmental program run by the UFC. Season 8 was hosted by the coaching duo of former UFC heavyweight champion Frank Mir and former Pride FC fighter Antonio Nogueira, and featured an array of contestants from both light heavyweight and heavyweight divisions, with one amongst them, of course, being Browning. Junie was on Mir's team and managed to put in a few impressive performances, but his constant alcoholism earned him a lot of shtick, and he even started to pick fights with various members of the cast. Living in a giant mansion with a bunch of other fighters who you're invariably going to have to beat up to win already sounds tense enough, without having to deal with one of those fighters getting wasted daily and prompting random altercations. The situation got so bad that the UFC head coach honcho Dana White had to be called to the house to sort things out, and bizarrely, he continued to give Browning chances to correct himself. Browning eventually went out in the semifinals of the competition after losing against eventual winner Efrain Escudero, and he would go on to pretty much fade out of the spotlight, achieving nothing of particular note with the UFC or any other MMA promotion. He still ended up in the headlines, however, as unfortunately his issues with alcohol continued on into his personal life. A 2011 brawl in a local Thailand bar, where Browning tried to take on 5 members of staff, resulted in Junie being attacked by various members of the public public and then threatened by members of the Phuket Mafia. Browning, having sustained various stab wounds during the bar brawl, waited 10 days to report his issues to the police out of fear for his life. Moving on to Jon Jones's issue with toys. Granted, this one is a bit of comedic relief in comparison to some of the other entries on this list, but good God, is this a funny entry. And in fairness, it did generate a decent amount of anger and debate when it first happened, which makes it even funnier because it is such a ridiculous series of events that never really needed to happen. This all happened back in July of 2011 when Jon Bones Jones, who was the reigning UFC lightweight champion at the time, took part in a question and answer session alongside featherweight division fighter Uriah Faber as part of a promotional tour for K-Swiss, who sponsored both fighters at the time. During the Q&A, the pair were asked what one thing they would change about the world of MMA if possible, and even fans of the sport will gladly accept that there are quite a few ways in which things could be improved. The UFC in particular has come under fire for still lacking in providing the pay that many of its fighters deserve, and there could also be ways of improving the officiating side of the sport as well. So there was plenty that Jon Jones could have discussed as his possible answer. So what's that one thing about MMA that just ticks him off so much that he would use his one chance at changing the entire sport? Well, to quote him in full, it's a silly one. I would get rid of the replica belts. As he admits, it is a very silly answer, and perhaps you'll hear that and believe that it's a joke. But he went on to elaborate that he genuinely hates it when fans come up to him with replica UFC toy belts and ask him to sign them, as he worked 3 times a day for 3 years to get his own belt and finds it unfair that fans can just buy one. Jones went on to declare that he never signs these replica belts when fans come asking for autographs, which is just the cherry on top of his hilariously petty Sunday. MMA forums and message boards reacted in the way you'd imagine for the internet, essentially crucifying Jones. And whilst we think that it's a bit of an overreaction, it is a very weird hill for Jon to die on. Finally, Luis Resto ends a career. It is absolutely impossible to make a video talking about the various controversial moments of fighters within sports like MMA or boxing without mentioning Luis Resto, partly because what he did was so very serious and outright disrespectable that it's almost in its own category of controversial. To set the scene a bit, Billy Collins was one of the rising stars of American boxing back in the early 1980s, having debuted in 1981 and boasting a record of 14 straight victories and 0 defeats by the time of his clash with Luis Resto, about that he entered as a laughably strong favorite. Resto at the time held a fairly decent record of 28-1, but had only managed to win 8 fights by knockout in his career, earning him a reputation as a light-punching journeyman who was practically unknown outside of his home turf of New York. The fight took place in the undercard of a bout between Roberto Duran and Davey Moore at Madison Square Garden in June of 1983, and in a great shock to most fans and experts, Resto absolutely battered Collins, despite the undefeated prospect managing to go the distance. Resto was scored as the unanimous victor by the judges, and for a moment, his ruse seemed like it had gone perfectly. And then Collins' father went to shake Resto's hand, immediately discovering that they felt a lot thinner than boxing gloves are supposed to feel. Resto had cheated. The gloves were quickly impounded and investigated, with the New York Athletic Commission discovering that an ounce of padding had been removed from the gloves, and then they found out that Resto had soaked his hand wraps in plaster of Paris, a substance that hardened the wraps that Resto then used to pulverize Collins. Resto and his coach had their licenses revoked and eventually found themselves guilty of assault and conspiracy, along with possession of a weapon due to Resto's hands being deemed as such. But it was too late for Collins. His injuries sustained thanks to Resto's cheating were so bad that he was forced to retire from boxing, and only a few months later, he died in a drunk driving accident, with many suggesting that it was the loss of his livelihood that drove him to such a state. That's all for today. Are there any other controversial fighter moments that you can think of? You should let us know down in the comments. And until next time, we'll see you soon.